Okay, so again, both of these are examples of what you see as number 2 in that begging the question diagram on page 157. Let me get this big thing out of the way. You know, basically, these are two, and note you have an entrance indicator. Okay, so there's your premise, and there's your premise, but there's your conclusion. And both of them are cases where the conclusion pretty much just restates the premise in different words. So it's a circular argument. It's begging the question. Now, here's one of the first variety. This is an argument that my parents' generation would make me. Heavy metal rock stars are not musicians because the noise that they make is not music, right? Well, you know, again, it begs the question, well, how do you know that what they play is not music? In other words, it assumes but doesn't prove, you know, the premise that heavy metal music is, you know, or what's played by heavy metal rock stars is not music. So you're basically assuming that, you're not proving it. So if you say they're not musicians because what they play isn't music, well, you know, it invites or begs the question, well, how do you know what they play isn't music? And the other type of begging the question argument is more involved, and I have an example of this here too. It actually works much better with these mics, but you have to remember to put it on. Now, it's probably somewhere in the 49 megahertz range. Most of these are somewhere around there. Not cell phone frequencies. At any rate, so those were examples of basically, I guess since there's no sound, let me just repeat it if somebody. So these two were examples of the second version where the conclusion simply restates the premise in a begging the question fallacy. Number 2 is an example of the first version where you're sneaking in a hidden premise that what heavy metal rock stars play is not music. And then the last type is more involved. And that's kind of illustrated by this slide. Some people call this vicious circularity. This is the one illustrated as number 3 on page 157, where the article, not the article, but the argument goes through several, sometimes complicated steps. But it basically dumps you out at the end of everything back at the beginning. And so it goes in one big circle, basically. And here's an example. Short and long were characters that Copy used to use, so I made one of my own using those two characters. The Earth is experiencing global warming. Well, what makes you so sure? Well, many renowned scientists have claimed we are. Well, how do they know? Why, they have statistics to prove it. And how do they know that their statistics, or in this case, their computer models, show global warming as opposed to some cyclical phenomenon? Oh, well, these experts are sure it's global warming. Or you're sort of going in one big circle. You don't really establish anything. And this is a much simpler example from Irving Copey's textbook. Of a one where there's vicious circularity. A professor is trying to get a loan from a bank loan officer. Bank officer, you say, Dr. Scott, that you will repay this unsecured loan. An unsecured loan is one where there's nothing backing. It's basically a signature loan. So they can't repossess your car or, foreclose on your house because there's nothing backing it. So, okay, you say that you'll repay this unsecured loan. How does my bank know that you are honest and trustworthy so we can take your word for this? And Dr. Scott says, you can ask my department chairperson, Dr. Aldape. The bank officer, but how do we know that we can rely on the word of Dr. Aldape? And Dr. Scott comes back, oh, don't worry about that. I can vouch for him without reservation. You see what's going on there? They say, well, how do we know we can take your word for it? And he says, well, ask my chairperson. And so the bank officer says, well, how do we know you can take your chairperson's word for it? And the person says, well, I can vouch for him. Well, the whole thing goes in one big circle, and it doesn't establish anything, So that's, those are some additional examples of debating the question fallacy, petitio principii, to go with the ones in your text. The next one should be easy to identify, but for some reason a lot of people don't. But in the see a question, sometimes there are ways that you can ask a question that presumes the answer you want to get. People know this. There's been research done about public opinion surveys, and very often, we know that how somebody responds on question 6 depends on what you ask them on questions 1 through 5. The questions aren't independent of one another. But sometimes you can ask a single question, and this is why we call it a complex question. But what you basically assume in a complex question is what you're supposing to establish. So it's similar to a circular argument. In other words, you're presuming the conclusion you want the person to come to that you ask the question. And the most time-honored example of this is the old lawyer's question. You know, have you stopped beating your wife, Mr. X? You know, don't explain. Answer me yes or no. Have you stopped beating your wife? Well, think about that. If he says yes, it means he's not beating his wife now, but he used to beat his wife, right? And of course, if he says no, it's even worse yet, because he's saying not only have I been beating my wife, I'm still beating my wife. You know, and so if this is what the lawyer is supposed to establish, they pretty much assume, the lawyers assume what they're supposed to be proving in court, namely that the guy has been beating his wife, right? So, you know, so either answer assumes what's at issue, you know. So it's a fallacy of presumption, you know, and you basically presume, and you know, these examples of these are pretty easy to come up with, right? Are you still a lousy housekeeper? Well, this assumes that you have been a lousy housekeeper, right? I've seen reporters ask politicians something like this, you know, Miss Politician, how are you going to defend your poor Senate voting record? Well, of course, this assumes that her voting record was poor, right? And so you build in basically the things what you are supposed to be establishing. So it's now a complex question is not exactly an argument itself, but it presumes an argument. It contains an implicit argument. Thus, though not an argument, on page 160, as such, a complex question involves an implicit argument. This argument is usually intended to trap the respondent into acknowledging something that he or she might otherwise, not want to acknowledge. Like, have you stopped cheating on exams? Where did you hide the marijuana you were smoking? So, and they explain basically things as I explained here. Basically practice. So of course, one main clue to whether or not you have a complex question is whether you have a question as the example that you're supposed to, pronounce what type of fallacy it is. So, at any rate, I'm not going to get into whether a complex question is different from a leading question. If you go to law school, you can worry about that. Well, a dichotomy argument, literally the word means to cut it in two. But a legitimate dichotomy is a case, it's an either-or argument where there are only two possibilities. And so there are legitimate uses of a dichotomy argument where you conclude that the other option must be the case by eliminating one of the options. But when someone commits the fallacy of a false dichotomy, well, you can say, well, why is it a false dichotomy? Well, basically, someone presents two options as if they were the only options, to consider when they really aren't, when there really are other ones, and then they'll usually eliminate one of them as they're arguing and focus on the other as their conclusion. So it's committed when a disjunctive, an either-or argument, presents two unlikely alternatives as if they were the only ones available, and then the arguer eliminates the undesirable alternative, leaving the desirable one as a conclusion. Yeah, usually you cite something that the person wouldn't want as the conclusion. So it says such an argument is clearly valid, and we'll see that these arguments are valid. P or Q, not P, therefore Q, is a valid argument in deductive propositional logic, or P and Q stand for complete statements. But again, but what he says is, since the disjunctive premise is false, or at least probably false, the argument is unsound. The fallacy is often committed by children when arguing with their parents, by advertisers, and by adults generally. Either you use UltraGuard deodorant or you risk the chance of perspiration odor. Surely you don't want to risk the chance of perspiration odor, therefore you want to use UltraGuard deodorant. Well, there are other options, other ways to avoid perspiration odor than using their product, right? Now this one, I was researching some of them. Disjunctive argument, as we said, is a valid argument form ordinarily, but it's valid when you really do have two options, and only two, when it really is a dichotomy. So note the last statement I have here. This fallacy makes a false disjunctive premise appear to be true by implying that the two options presented are the only relevant ones. And I will admit I grabbed this one off the internet. I probably should put a reference, but I thought it was such a good example. And it was given as an example of the false dichotomy. Right? A girlfriend says to her boyfriend, well, look, either you love Justin Bieber or you're jealous of him. And you say you don't like him, so you must be jealous of him. Right? Well, maybe he doesn't care one way or another about Justin Bieber. Right? In other words, the arguer in this example is saying, well, P, either you love Justin Bieber, or Q, you're jealous of him. I can see you don't like him, so you don't love him. Therefore, the conclusion is you must be jealous of him. But the point is, if you're talking about her boyfriend's opinions of Justin Bieber, these are not the only two possible options. Either you're really crazy about the guy or you're jealous of him, So here the arguer presents two options as if they're the only one, and then eliminates one of them, and then focuses on the other as her conclusion. So I say her options are neither exhaustive. In other words, there are more options out there in terms of how he might feel. He might be completely indifferent about Justin Bieber. He doesn't care, what Justin Bieber does. He's totally uninterested, right? So our options are neither exhaustive nor mutually exclusive. that it's possible to hold more than one of them. So her argument is fallacious, you know. So I mean, I thought this was a particularly good example of exactly what we're talking about in terms of a false dichotomy. So here the key is a false dichotomy. You're basically presenting only two options when there are really more than two. Well, now, on page 49, when we looked at inductive arguments, just generally, we noted that one of the things a good inductive argument should do is not leave out some very crucial piece of evidence. And they call that the total evidence requirement. Especially, it should not leave out a crucial piece of evidence that would tend to support the opposite conclusion from what the arguer is arguing for. Right? So, the fallacy of suppressed evidence, then, is committed when someone gives an inductive argument that does not mention some very important piece of evidence that, if included in their reasoning, would tend to support the opposite conclusion from the one that they want to draw. So that's the fallacy of suppressed evidence. So that's what we mean in saying it violates the total evidence requirement. It leaves out a very crucial piece of evidence. So, to commit it, the arguer omits a crucial premise or a piece of evidence that outweighs the presented evidence and should lead to a different, usually to an opposite conclusion of the one that they want to draw. So it's a fallacy of presumption, as I say in the last statement here, because the arguer wrongly presumes and gives the impression that the evidence they present is all of the relevant evidence, when it turns out not to be. So, if an inductive argument does indeed ignore such evidence, then the argument commits the fallacy of suppressed evidence. Consider, most dogs are friendly and pose no threat to people who pet them. Therefore, it would be safe to pet the little dog that is approaching us now. Well, if the arguer ignores the fact that the little dogs are excited and foaming at the mouth, or some important piece of evidence, then that would commit the fallacy of suppressed evidence. I'm not too crazy about this Kentucky Fried Chicken example. They give an example that during the past 6 years, Poland has enjoyed a rather low standard of living, therefore it will continue to do so. But, an argument like that would totally leave out the fact that there's been a complete change in economics, in the prevailing economic, government from from communism to free market capitalism. And so at any rate, now I know this is maybe a bit harder one to try to nail down, but the point is, and I don't know how many of these I'm going to give you, because you usually have to know something in context about the situation. In other words, to know they're committing a fallacy, you have to know that there is an important piece of evidence that they're leaving out. And it's a little hard to reflect that in an example. But at any rate, it's a fallacious way of reasoning, but it happens all the time. You see it in things like advertising, and you see it in political ads. I mean, where somebody has an agenda and they leave out. Yeah, I mean, there was a global warming not too long ago, a few years ago, or 2 years ago, where they were saying, "Oh yeah, and we must really be having warming because the average temperature in the U.S. was more than it has been in the past several years." But when you're talking warming over the whole planet, the average mean temperature across the whole planet was actually cooler. But what they didn't tell you is they're focusing on only one, area of the globe to make the conclusion that everything's getting warmer. Here's one that came from the Republican primary a few years back. Newt Gingrich, basically, he criticized Romney for working for Bain Capital, private equity firm. But it turned out that Newt Gingrich himself worked for a similar firm by the name of Forstmann Little. So, in other words, Gingrich was trying to say, hey, I wouldn't be, working for any kind of a cutthroat private capitalist firm like that might be corporate raiders, buy companies to break them up, So, though claiming he was not nearly as enamored of a Wall Street model, like Romney, he omitted evidence that may tell a different story. So, in other words, he neglected to mention his own involvement with a similar firm, and of course he's trying to say that he wasn't enamored with those types of firms, but of course, knowing that Gingrich actually worked for one of those types of firms would lead to the opposite conclusion, that he approved of them, at least enough to have worked for one. So Gingrich here, who for the most part is a pretty good arguer, but here it seems to have committed a fallacy of suppressed evidence, that he's leaving out something that's extremely important. And, well, the fallacy of equivocation comes when typically use a word or phrase with two meanings, but you don't let the person who hears your argument know that that's what you're doing. And in classical logic, this was called the fallacy of four terms, because a syllogism has only three terms. That is, only three words that designate three separate classes of things. Whereas the fallacy of four terms occurs when one of the words you're using is used with two different meanings. So the fallacy of equivocation occurs when the conclusion of an argument depends on the fact that a word or phrase is used in two different senses in the argument. Especially, in one sense in the premises and in another sense in the conclusion. Some triangles are obtuse. Whatever is obtuse is ignorant. Therefore, some triangles are ignorant. A good example that one of my hopefully everybody has this homework number 4 assignment. Now, if you're a vegetarian, you won't agree with this argument. But if you're not, you could say, well, nothing is better than a nice, juicy steak. Wrong kind of steak. Right. A crust of dry or dried bread is better than nothing. Therefore, a crust of dry bread is better than a nice juicy steak. Right. And the point is, and this is the last, you know there's something wrong here. What's wrong? Well, basically, it has to do with the use of the word nothing, right? Nothing is better than a nice juicy steak. Here you're saying no other thing that you could eat is better than a nice juicy steak. Whereas here, if you say a crust of dry bread is better than nothing, you're saying nothing in the sense of nothing at all. I mean, if you were starving, and hadn't eaten in a week, maybe a crust of dry bread would be better than nothing, right? So this looks like a good piece of reasoning, which leads to a conclusion that most of us wouldn't want to buy, unless maybe we're vegetarian. But what's gone wrong here is the same word, nothing, is being used in two different senses. And so it only looks like a good argument. So we'll pick up with the rest of these. There are only a few left. And then, we'll go over the homework on Monday. So stay dry, have a good weekend. If you came in after I call the roll, let me know you're here. Let me stop this recording.